This is a Squiz podcast. We're your shortcut to being informed. Nick, you've been running Broadsheet since 2009. That's a long time. How did it come to be? Just tell me the founding story, I guess.
Okay, so the founding story is I was like many Aussie kids in that I'd finished university. I did an arts degree at Monash in politics and cinema. Took myself off to London to explore the world. And what I discovered was I was in these exciting cities with so much happening. But getting into these cities and sort of figuring out what to do and where to go and, you know, where to get a coffee or where to take someone on a date or, you know, where to get a beer was really difficult. You sort of had to know somebody who knew the city really well. And if you're a traveler or you're just sort of a young person, I was sort of 22 or 23, it's just really difficult. And the internet was very much a thing, but still emerging. Sort of, yeah, I think I got my first Facebook account at a sort of similar time. There were restaurant guides, but they were very much like classifieds. Like the restaurants would pay to be involved. So they were sort of useless from a credibility point of view. And, you know, if I was lucky to get something or if I saw it in print, it was a weekly restaurant review. It was like in London, at that era, it was a Gordon Ramsay restaurant I couldn't dream of affording. So the idea of getting some, I guess what I was looking for as a consumer at that point was something to tell me where to go. I didn't care about the negative reviews. I was just saying, like, somebody with credibility whose taste I trust, tell me where to go and what to do. Just give me the resource and the tool and keep me informed about what's happening in these cities sort of from a cultural perspective. And it just didn't exist, but I saw it so clearly in my eyes, like what this thing should be. So I came back to Melbourne. I was probably 24, 23. And Melbourne was going through this huge cultural boom. It was when Andrew McConnell had just opened Cumulus. Third wave, especially coffee, was becoming a thing. I borrowed 20 grand from the bank, which was enough to build a website and get a logo and an identity made. And I went for it. It just started very slowly. And I'd write some content, and then some friends would write some content. We get an audience. We finally got a little bit of advertising. That allowed me to hire an editor. We had more audience than I hired an ad sales guy. And then it sort of snowballed from there. And 15 years later, it's still snowballing.
Still snowballing. I mean, you're in every city now across Australia?
Yep, and New Zealand.
Every city. What are I'm interested in the way that you talked about the fact that most of the reviews and most of the work that old media were doing in culture and in hospitality was paid. How does Broadsheet approach that?
So when we're covering the city, we take our credibility very seriously. So we don't take money from restaurants or from the sort of the cultural world in any sense. We do work, we're an advertising-led business, but we work with major brands with sort of through media agencies. So our big clients are, Disney, or we work with financial institutions or automotive companies or alcohol companies are sort of our big categories. We do a little bit of work with the cultural institutions. So we have media partnerships with, the sort of symphonies around the country, or the National Gallery Victoria, or the MCA, or Art Gallery New South Wales. So we work with them in a media partnership capacity, but we take our credibility very seriously. So certainly from the hospitality industry, we don't take money for comment. Let's
fast forward quite a bit through the years of you owning Broadsheet to when COVID hit, so the start of 2020. I'm really interested in what your immediate thoughts were for not just your business, I guess, but for the sector broadly, and for what your expectations were of what that impact would be.
So good question. It really helped us understand our business, even though it was 10 years in. It was this moment in time. So maybe if I talk about how our business responded first, but it was certainly tied with how the cities responded. So I remember sitting down with Katja Vachtel, who's our editorial director. When I say sit down, on a Zoom call, a video call.
Yeah, I was going to say.
One of the early ones. And sort of looking at each other going, shit, we cover cities and our cities are closing down. What are we going to do here? And it took us about 10 seconds. We're like, wait a second, we don't cover cities. We cover culture and we cover community. And we're journalists and we report news. So we adopted this platform that we called Culture Never Stops. So no matter what happens, no matter, a restaurant might close or the theater company might close down or pause, but they're not doing anything. And I guess this is when it becomes, what's the city doing? And the restaurants were so innovative. They were doing the takeaway food. They were doing, performances at home. Everyone was exercising. You're still eating. You're still cooking. You're still watching movies. So we actually found we had this really important role in helping people, maintain rich cultural lives through their through the kind of lockdown period. And that became really rewarding. And we had like our biggest traffic we'd ever had to date was through that period, which was kind of amazing. The other thing we did was we interpreted what all these rules and regulations meant for the way you lived. So Premier A, B, C, D, and E would stand up and we'd say, okay, so the new restrictions are X, Y, and Z, or the new easing of restrictions are A, B, C, D. And we'd say, okay, well, what does that actually mean for how you interact with your friends, with how you can spend your time, with how you live your cultural life? So it ended up being obviously very scary at the beginning, but ultimately very rewarding and very meaningful.
I do want to zoom out first and talk about the sector. So do you think the sector, culture sector, hospitality sector, events sector, do you think it's recovered from that period? I mean, initially we were thinking COVID would be maybe a few months, then we thought maybe a year, and then it ended up being 2 years. And I mean, you really were in the thick of it in Melbourne. Do you feel like it's recovered?
No, I think we had COVID, which is obviously very, very difficult, the actual, quote unquote official period. Then there was this, like many industries, this like peak of spike of optimism and excitement, and everyone was out spending all the money they'd saved up or through the government initiatives. But then, hospitality and cultural industries ride on the consumer confidence and the amount of money that people have or feel like they can spend. So we're going through this sort of prolonged period for the last, let's say, 18 months of it's almost ever decreasing confidence in that sector. So we're seeing business do it really tough out there in these communities. And I hope that turns around very quickly.
What are you seeing what we're talking about here is cost of living. What is the first thing to go from your audience? Like, what is the first thing they don't do anymore? I'm interested if it's like the big, dining out, or is it they just cut back on their coffee every day? Like, what do you sort of see?
Well, what we're hearing is it's probably less frequency in terms of their going out, whether it's a restaurant or it's going to the theater. Instead of going to the theater 3 times a year, they go twice a year, once a year. What we'd heard initially was that the covers, in terms of the amount of people coming through a venue, were not decreasing, but the spend per head was decreasing. So it wasn't a big boozy dinner with bottles of wine and cocktails, which is what it was,
back end of 2022 or 20
exactly like in that period where all of a sudden it was just champagne and caviar in every menu.
Go for it.
It sort of felt like end of day. It was like, oh my God, what is going on here? But no, it's very much not that. It's people going out and maybe their main course is costing a lot more than it did a year ago because the cost of goods and the cost of labor has gone up. All the costs on the hospitality side have gone up. So they may be having a more expensive main course and a glass of wine or a single bottle of wine or a cheaper bottle of wine. But I think now what we're hearing and is, sort of not very pleasant to talk about or hear about is that now the frequency is declining as well, which is it's making it really hard out there.
It's, the pinch really feels very real at the moment. One thing I'm interested in, and one of the big news stories that's been kicking around, and certainly it's a big topic of conversation in our office, is the trouble with running events. So we've got festivals that have said they're either not continuing or they will be, waiting till the next year or perhaps coming back the year after. A couple of examples in Tasmania, Splendour in the Grass was cancelled. The National Writers' Festival I saw has postponed this year. Vivid has even had mixed reviews. What are you seeing? What's going on? What is the reason for this?
Well, it's exactly what you're saying. And I think it's the same as we talked about with the hospitality industry. It's the cost of putting on these events is so extreme now that the risk just gets so high. And if you don't sell the tickets up front, you don't get it. It doesn't work. The whole thing doesn't stack up. And my understanding is that's what happened at Splendour. They put out a lineup. They put the show on. They committed to it. We're not committed to it. They put it out there. They saw the ticket sales coming in and thought this isn't enough. This is not sustainable. So they ultimately made that difficult decision, which is it's a real shame.
There is some commentary though around that it might be that they're not in touch with their audience. They're not getting the acts that they used to be able to get. It could be applied to various events. Do you think there's any merit in that?
Look, possibly. I think that's probably on a case by case basis. But ultimately, it doesn't matter who you've got if you don't have an audience that is prepared to buy the ticket. And probably the ticket's more expensive than it was because the cost of putting it on is so much higher. It's also probably more, I'd say it's more competitive globally for big touring acts. It's a tough business right now.
I was listening to a podcast you did a couple of years ago, and you talked about Broadsheet, and you talked about the experience of being out and about and how important that was for you, and why it was a big part of the reason why you started Broadsheet. How's that changed in a world where we now shop online, we order food to our door, for example? Do you think that's changed much, or do you think the fundamental of going out is still the same?
I think the fundamental of going out is still the same. And maybe that's not the way everyone's living, but I think it's so important. I was reading an article in The Economist this weekend about why do Southern Europeans live longer. And one of the sort of hypotheses in this piece was that they all live around piazzas and squares, and it's sort of denser living. And it's that social interaction and sort of community cohesion that actually leads to longer life expectancy. And I was thinking about that through the lens of, we now have food delivery services where you eat your sort of noodles or curry or whatever it is in front of the TV. I think, and that's how sad that is. Like, go out and have a bowl of pasta, even if you're by yourself, and talk to the waiter. Like, just interact and engage with your community. It's really a sort of core tenet of everything I believe in, and certainly Broadsheet believes, is just getting out and about and spending time amongst it.
There's so much around about people being lonely, issues around mental health. How much of that, I mean, your Broadsheet obviously depends on social media, that we all have to be there as publishers, and it's what your audience expects, but how much blame do you place on social media for that problem, I guess, that problem of loneliness?
I think really meaningful. And I think obviously there's a lot of data and research to support that. It's sort of not my theory. It's just what the data is telling us really clearly. I think social media has a lot to answer for. So it was Claire O'Neill, the Minister for Home Affairs, who said that, I'm paraphrasing here, but nearly every societal problem is either caused by or made worse by social media. And that's certainly something that I think is probably spot on. If we're glued to our phones the whole time, and if we think we're interacting with our community and our social group through the phones, you might be to a point, but it's so different to sitting down and having a cup of coffee with a friend. And I do worry we're losing that. I feel like I'm sounding old here, though.
Yeah, but you know what? That's okay. I mean, you're not that old, and it's a problem that we're all talking about. And I think it's probably, I will come back to Broadsheet, and I have some questions to ask you just about, some of the really positive stuff. But I think we need to put your other hat on now and talk about your role as a board member of the Digital Publishers Alliance. We've spoken to our audience and those listening a bit about the fact that Meta has walked away from doing deals with news publishers here in Australia to pay for content. Let me just set this up a little bit before I ask you about Broadsheet specifically, just for those who may not know. That is still in flux. So the government hasn't decided if they will designate Meta and Google and force them to negotiate with publishers. If that were to happen, the risk is that Meta would simply stop showing news content on their platform. I want to ask you directly how Broadsheet fits in here, because I think people can understand the risk of what some might call sort of public interest journalism coming off social media platforms and audiences not being able to find that content. But what they might not realise is this actually also extends to publishers like yourself.
Okay, so there's a few different ways to think about this, sort of cut this up. So one is, what is the downside of Meta cutting news? And the biggest issue is for the audience. So if Australian audiences and Australian population are seeing anything that could possibly go on social media except for news, and when I say news, I'm using the term broadly, professionally produced content is really what I mean. So from publishers like us, or sports publishers, or hard news publishers, Australian publishers and global publishers, just anything Australian communities can't see it and audiences can't see it. That means you're only seeing the things that are unverified, are produced without journalism, and there's lots of good content that fits in that category. But when you have only that and not journalism and not a professionally produced content, it's rife for scams, misinformation, disinformation, just ugly places without the ballast of professionally produced news. So that's bad. A second reason it's terrible is because it starves publishers from a really important distribution point for their content. So news has to be found. News has to be discovered. And Australians, like it or loathe it, spend millions of hours on social media, on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, Google. And If they can't find it through that channel, that means they're finding it less often. And it was the University of Canberra study that came out a couple of weeks ago that said that 48% of Australians use social media to consume news. So that's just gone overnight. So that's bad. The sort of winding back a bit, we look at the way Facebook is behaving and Meta's behaving. Meta are clearly saying that they are going to pick and choose what laws and regulations they're going to follow in Australia. They pay very, very, very little tax on something like $5 billion in revenue. They only reported $1.3 billion, and they offshored the rest to tax havens around the world. They basically say, we're going to follow the laws that we care about, that we think are fine, but otherwise we're just going to kind of ignore you guys. I think that's an appalling way to behave. No other business that operates in Australia is able to behave like that. But these global giants are so powerful that they think they can. And then when it comes to, I guess, the sort of another component of it is, why does it matter for Broadsheet versus a 9 or a 7 or a News Corp? Is the media industry is an ecosystem. So all of those big publishers have players that or titles or journalists that interact exactly with we do. We compete with these guys every day. And I love competing with News at 9 and 7 and the big guys. I love it. I built a business to do it. It's been a good business. But if they are in a position where they're getting funding and we're not getting funding from the News Media Bargaining Code, then that puts us at a disadvantage and threatens sort of our very existence and our livelihood. So that's a problem. The work that I'm doing with the Digital Publishers Alliance is to realign this. We're advocating that if Google and Meta are going to operate in this country, they need to operate by our laws. They need to make news available to their audiences. And any outcome has got to benefit the entire media ecosystem, not just a privileged few.
Lots to unpack there. I think the main thing that I want to pick up with you is one that we haven't talked a lot about at the Squiz here and on this podcast, and that is this issue of the way they operate here as a business. How has that been in your mind, now that I know you've gone deep on this, how has that been allowed to be the case? Like, where did we miss a step in this?
So I think it's not just Australia, but it's the whole world.
Yes.
So for a long time, these companies were considered the darlings of innovation. We're like, oh my God, they're so clever. I love spending time on Facebook and Instagram. Google's so clever. The world's information at my fingertips. And, you go back to the US where they passed Section 230, which basically allowed them to not operate as publishers. They could operate as so-called platforms. So what that meant was that they were not liable for the content or the output on their systems. But what that meant is they're still competing with the media, the established media, because they're selling advertising and they're squeezing the media industry in their advertising dollars. But at the same time, they're saying like, oh, if we can have chat rooms with terrorists and we can have, we'll do our best to deal with sort of, sexual exploitation and extortion. But, it's sort of not our responsibility. Like we'll help you out. We'll do our best, but we're not liable for it. Whereas if you're the media, you have to be accountable. You've got to have complaints processes. You've got to have defamation laws. There's so much you've got to do. So these guys just sort of get away with it. And then when they kind of roll out their business from the US across the entire world, that's the sort of precedent that they're operating on.
What is your greatest fear in all of this? I mean, you've got your business to worry about.
Yeah.
Is that your greatest fear?
Obviously, I'm worried about my business. That's what I do. Yeah. I employ 70 odd people. We like running our business. We enjoy it. We'd like to stay in business. We'd like to grow. However, my real fear is the damage this is doing to society and to communities in Australia. I think we're seeing we're probably past the slippery slope part where we're seeing a decline in the quality of the discourse. We're seeing, factionalism, two-sidesism all over the place. And I put that squarely at the feet of social media.
You've called, as far as solutions, you've called for a social license. Mm-hmm. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so it's sort of what I was referring to before, the idea that if a big global multinational company is going to operate in Australia, they've got to sign up to a social license. That should be a basic requirement. And what I mean by a social license is they should say, we're going to be a positive contributor to Australia. We're going to pay our fair share of tax. We're going to think about how we can support Australian communities, and not just think about, actively do that. We're going to contribute to the news media system that we benefit from. we're going to abide by the directions of the e-safety commissioner. We're going to do our best not to destroy the mental health of young Australians. Like, they've got to take these commitments. Any other business operating here has to do that. So why should these guys be exempt?
How does that work in practice?
I think it's going to be a series of regulations and laws that get passed, and they will have the opportunity to abide by the laws, or they can decide that they don't want to operate in this country. And
are those laws specific to Meta and Google? Are we talking, I mean, we barely talk about TikTok.
TikTok, certainly. YouTube, certainly. I think, these are also, some of these might be laws that are specific to the digital platforms because they are unique in the way they operate. But others are just laws that already exist, and it's how we classify those businesses. So to run a media business, you need a complaints process, and you need to be held up to defamation, like pretty harsh defamation laws in this country. So we have to classify those businesses as also being responsible for similar regulations or more.
One of the other big things coming at us all is AI, although it's a funny one because we've been using AI for a really long time, but it feels like it just entered the conversation in a big way. Changes coming to Google in particular. So Google Overview was I guess, revealed to us all not long ago. And what that will mean for people listening in the simplest of terms is that when you Google something, it will give you an answer directly rather than feed a publisher's site or a website or in the same way that it used to. How might that affect Broadsheet? How worried are you about that change?
Quite worried. This is the next big topic. In fact, I think this one's bigger than the News Media Bargaining Code. Because it's more existential for every publisher or every content creator or every creator of any kind globally. So the way those systems work, and if we just talk about the AI overviews specifically, because we can keep going to the thousands of different models. There's so much to consider. But just to focus on that one.
I like this one because, and I'll tell you why, Nick, just before you get into it, because it's something we all use every day. Mm-hmm. So you can kind of get your head around this change in a way that you can't with some of the other bits and pieces.
100%. So the way it works is Google, let's take Broadsheet, for example. Google will scrape our site, read our content, ingest it, and then let's say a really basic keyword that we get traffic from, that we sort of answer audience queries, is the best restaurants in Sydney. So somebody Googles best restaurants in Sydney, Broadsheet comes up with a result. You can read through it. Broadsheet's got the sort of, has reported this, researched it, taken photographs, paid someone to write it up, paid someone to design the page. We package this thing together. It's part of our business. And as a result, we sort of put advertising around it and we make money through advertising. What Google's doing is they're reading that content. And then, Kate, when you go and AI overviews eventually get rolled out in Australia, you'll say best restaurants in Sydney, and Google will say the best restaurants in Sydney are A, B, C, D, and E. And they'll have pulled that from our website as well as our sort of category peers, whether it's Urban List or Time Out or Concrete Playground or Gourmet Travel or others. And so then Broadsheet and its peers don't get that click, therefore can't serve the advertising. So the whole thing breaks because we have no incentive to create the content in the first place if they're just going to steal it. I just cannot see how this is going to be legal. We're going to have to go through a process of court cases, and the New York Times have sued OpenAI, who's a sort of a big.
This has already started.
It's already started, but it's going to take years. And my hope is that we don't destroy the media industry on the way through. I actually think that AI is obviously a wonderful, magical technology that we're all going to benefit from. But we have to sort of get to the other side first. We have to make sure that the things that we want and we like are protected. It's
an interesting one because you kind of, the way that you, and when I'm talking about you, I'm talking about myself and people listening and you as a consumer, Google things now is you Google it and then you sort of go through your trusted sources and if you see Broadsheet pop up, you go, oh yeah, I trust Broadsheet. I like Broadsheet. I'm going to trust, what they tell me about the best restaurant is the place to go. It'll be interesting to have that change so much where it's literally just a sentence saying the best restaurant in Sydney is X without knowing why.
Yeah.
And I wonder how much audiences actually do want to know why.
I think that's right. Like, I think I think just because AI overviews exist doesn't mean that that's the way consumer behavior will evolve. I have a hope. I don't think it's naive. I think it's something we consider that people want to know where their content comes from, and I think brand matters more than ever in this kind of new world. So Broadsheet, we spend a lot of time thinking about our brand and building trust on our brand, and sort of what we talked about at the beginning of credibility being centered to us is important. I think back to the early 15 years ago when I started this thing. It wasn't that you couldn't figure out where restaurants were or what the restaurants in London or Sydney and Melbourne were. You could still find that information. It was just, could you find it in a way that was credible, that you trusted, that you actually thought, no, I align with this particular point of view or this taste or this curatorial kind of approach. And that was our offering. So we're sort of going back to basics here a little bit. And that's certainly the way that our team is thinking about it in this new era.
Nick, I get a sense, and I mean, that it must be the case that you really know Australia. You really know the cities. You really know the culture. You've been doing this for long enough. What gets Aussies out and about? What's Australian about the way that we engage with culture, engage with hospitality, engage with events? Is there a specific Aussie thing about it?
Yeah, I think there is, actually. And it's almost impossible to sort of put your finger on, but you sort of know when you see it. I think about things like quality. We have such incredible produce in this country that you can taste the quality of the food that we produce. If we're talking about hospitality specifically. We love independence. So these big chains are sort of non-existent here that you see throughout the US and Europe and other places. We love personalities. We tend to know who's behind these places, and if person A is behind this venue, you might know that they're also behind venue B, D, and E. But it won't be like branded as this person. It's sort of like you have the inside knowledge. It's sort of hard to put your finger on, but these are the things that sort of tend to come up again and again and again.
Interesting. I have heard you say, though, that you'd like to take Broadsheet to other markets.
Yeah.
Is that progressing?
Yeah, definitely. We're looking at some expansion at the moment, which is exciting.
I watch with interest. I can only assume you get the hottest tickets in town. Would that be correct?
Yeah, it's one of the perks of the job.
I feel like there would be I feel like we kind of started the wrong business talking to you. We don't get a lot of perks in news, unfortunately, but you would get them. What's the best ticket you've ever got? Like, talk to me about a great experience you've had.
Oh. There have been a lot of really exciting ones. I've been invited this week to go to a collaboration of Tedesca and Firedoor in Tedesca and Victoria this week.
Yeah.
And I'm very excited for that. I think that's going to be a highlight.
And I'm asking everyone this, and you kind of already touched on it, but in the mix of our whole conversation, and you can go with this wherever you like, what are you hopeful about? What are you most hopeful about?
So I'd say right now, as you're getting me on a Monday morning in late June, I am seeing a difficult scenario in everything that I think about. So that's from the media, from cost of living to the industries that we cover, sort of cultural industry we cover. And I think our cities, as a result, are under pressure. I think this is temporary. I think it's a cyclical kind of moment in time. And I'm hopeful across the board. So I'm hopeful that the consumer confidence, cost of living, inflation, all these sort of metrics that are important soften, and that we can go back to growth, and we can go back to sort of putting our shoulders back and our head up and saying, okay, we've got some confidence, and we're going out and we're sort of building our economy and building our businesses and living life in sort of a positive state rather than sort of a sort of defensive state, which is what we're seeing at the moment, I think. As a result, our cultural businesses begin thriving. They go from defense mode where they're putting on specials and they're sort of managing their staff costs and they're sort of under pressure. Going back to, okay, I want to innovate. I want to try new things. I want to show the audience something that they haven't seen before. I think that's what I want. And from a media industry, I hope that we see the regulation and the support from the government that they're, suggesting that they want to provide, and we protect Australian business and Australian community, and we do the right thing. And I see that turnaround happening, and it's both like a government question, but it's also a consumer question. Like, we weren't having this conversation that you and I just had about the evils of social media 2 years ago, 3 years ago.
No.
And maybe you and I were as like media nerds, but certainly it wasn't like a topic of national conversation, which is what it is now. So I'm really, really hopeful that we sort of realign these sort of ideas of where we get our information and do we trust it, and actually who's pulling the strings here, and what's the algorithm feeding me, and what is it doing to my kids. I think that's necessary. So I'm hopeful that, you know, we're going through a difficult period right now in sort of nearly every direction you look, but that's a moment of time, and we'll be on the other side of it shortly.
Nick, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Kate.